The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
There's a story that the world thinks it knows. A princess, a crash in a Paris tunnel, a nation that wept for days, flowers piled high outside palace gates, candles lit by millions of hands that had never met her. And then silence. The official version closed like a book, and everyone was told to move on. But what if moving on was never part of Diana's plan? What if long before that August night in 1997, she had already arranged something so quietly brilliant, so deliberately hidden from royal eyes, that it would ripple forward through decades? What if the woman the palace spent years trying to silence had already figured out how to keep speaking long after she was gone? Today, we are going to talk about something that most royal commentators skip right past, something buried inside the legal language of a will, something that involves one person, one extraordinary decision, and a legacy that is still unfolding right now. Princess Diana left her estate to one person. Not the king, not the royal institution, not a committee of palace-approved lawyers. One person. And when you understand why, everything you thought you knew about the end of her story changes completely. To understand the will, you first have to understand the woman who wrote it. And to understand that woman, you have to go back before the cameras, before the global fame, before the 25-foot wedding train that swept down the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral on a July morning in 1981. Diana Frances Spencer grew up in the English countryside, on the sprawling Althorpe estate in Northamptonshire. On the surface, it looked like a privileged upbringing, surrounded by aristocratic tradition, rolling green lawns, and the quiet authority that old money carries. But beneath the surface, her childhood was fractured. Her parents' divorce, when she was just 7 years old, left a wound that never fully closed. She grew up watching love collapse, watching people she depended on disappear, and learning early that the world does not always keep its promises. She was working as a kindergarten aide when she met Charles. She was 20 years old. She was not a schemer or a strategist. She was, by most accounts, a gentle, slightly shy young woman who loved children, loved helping people, and had no real idea what she was walking into. The engagement was announced. The world erupted in excitement. And on that July morning, as an estimated 750 million people watched on television screens around the globe, Diana Spencer became the Princess of Wales. The dress was extraordinary. The ceremony was unforgettable. The crowds lining the streets of London that day were delirious with joy. For one shining moment, the fairy tale appeared to be completely real. But fairy tales have a way of ending the moment you stop performing them. Behind the closed doors of royal life, Diana found something she had not expected: profound loneliness. The institution she had married into was cold in ways that the public never saw. Charles had never truly severed his deep, emotional connection with Camilla Parker Bowles, a woman he had loved before Diana entered the picture. The relationship between Charles and Camilla continued, and Diana, with her acute emotional intelligence, sensed it long before she had proof. She has spoken about the feeling of being invisible inside her own marriage, of asking for help and receiving protocol instead of compassion, of reaching out and finding that the hand she needed was never extended. The loneliness curdled into something more serious. Diana developed bulimia, a battle she would later speak about with remarkable courage and honesty, describing it not as weakness, but as the inevitable result of a person desperately seeking control in a life that offered none. She hurt herself in private while performing radiance in public. She smiled for cameras and then went home to a marriage that had already quietly died. By the time the 1980s were drawing to a close, the cracks were spreading. In 1992, the Camilla Gate tapes became public, exposing intimate recorded conversations between Charles and Camilla. The humiliation was global. The formal separation was announced that same year. And then Diana did something that the British royal family had simply never seen before. She sat down with journalist Martin Bashir on the BBC program Panorama and spoke the truth. She described the loneliness. She confirmed the presence of a third party in her marriage. She said, quietly and without flinching, that she had always wanted to be the queen of people's hearts rather than a queen in a conventional sense. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was making a declaration. That interview changed everything. Diana had understood something that the palace had not. In a modern world, the camera is more powerful than any throne. The people watching her that night did not see a troubled princess causing a scandal. They saw a human being telling the truth, and they loved her for it in ways they had never loved the institution she was walking away from. What followed was a transformation as complete as any in modern history. Diana did not retreat into grief and anonymity. She accelerated. She walked through an active minefield in Angola in January 1997, wearing jeans and a sweater, no guards flanking her, no protective armor beyond her own conviction, and the photographs of that walk appeared in newspapers around the world. Governments were embarrassed. Conversations changed. The Ottawa Treaty banning anti-personnel landmines was signed later that year, and diplomats who worked on the treaty have consistently acknowledged that Diana's public advocacy forced the issue onto the international agenda in a way that years of behind-the-scenes negotiation had failed to do. She visited AIDS patients at a time when the public was terrified of the disease and the stigma surrounding it was devastating. She shook hands without gloves. She sat at bedsides. She looked people in the eye. She hugged children that others were afraid to touch. Her actions stripped away the fear and replaced it with something far more powerful, which was simple human dignity. She worked with leprosy patients, with homeless shelters, with children who had no families. She used her fame the way an earlier generation of royals had never imagined fame could be used. Not to maintain distance from suffering, but to close the distance entirely. The palace did not always appreciate this. There were those within the institution who found her emotional approach destabilizing, who preferred the composed and ceremonial model of royal charity work. But Diana had learned something they had not yet grasped. She had learned that real influence does not come from sitting above people. It comes from sitting beside them. Her divorce was finalized in 1996. She was 35 years old, free from a marriage, stripped of her HRH title, and more famous than she had ever been. She was also, for the first time in her adult life, truly alone in making decisions about her future. And it was in that moment of solitary freedom that she turned her attention to something she knew mattered more than anything else: what would happen after she was gone. Diana did not approach her casually. She was a woman who had spent years watching institutions protect themselves at the expense of individuals, and she had no intention of allowing that pattern to continue with her own legacy. She worked carefully. She thought about what she valued, what she feared, and what she wanted the world to still know about her when she was no longer there to speak for herself. The estate she was distributing was significant. Through her divorce settlement, through book deals, through the sale of personal jewelry and other assets, Diana had accumulated approximately £17 million. In today's terms, accounting for inflation and the appreciation of assets like her share of the Althorpe estate, that figure translates to something considerably larger. It represented a lifetime of public service converted into financial capital, and she was extraordinarily deliberate about where it would go. The broad structure of the will was clear. The majority of the estate, roughly 3/4, was directed toward charitable causes. These were not vague or generic designations. Diana specified her commitments: AIDS research and patient support, landmine removal and advocacy. Children's charities focused on the most vulnerable and overlooked. These were the causes she had given her public life to, and she was not going to abandon them in death. By directing the largest portion of her estate to these causes, she was doing something quietly radical. She was telling the world that her work had not been performance. It had been purpose, and purpose, unlike a title, cannot be revoked. The remaining quarter was held in trust for her 2 sons, William and Harry. This element of the will was not simply a financial arrangement. It was a deliberate act of protection. Diana had watched the royal institution operate for years. She understood how its pressures worked, how its expectations could distort and diminish the people inside it. She wanted her sons to have financial independence, a foundation that existed entirely outside the palace's control, so that if the day ever came when they needed to make choices that the institution disapproved of, they would have the resources to do so. But the most significant and least discussed decision she made was not about the money at all. It was about who would manage it. Diana appointed Paul Burrell as the sole executor of her estate. This was not an obvious choice by the standards of the world she moved through. She could have appointed a senior solicitor. She could have named a trusted, aristocratic friend. She could have worked with the palace's own legal team, which would certainly have been the path of least resistance. She chose none of those options. She chose the man who had served as her personal butler for a decade. The man who had made her tea in the quiet hours of the morning when she could not sleep. The man who knew where she kept her private letters and understood the weight of her silences. The man who had been present for her fear, her grief, her rage, and her laughter, and who had never once sold any of it. Paul Burrell was, by every external measure, an unlikely choice for one of the most consequential roles in modern royal history. He was a member of staff. He was not a lawyer, not an aristocrat, not a palace insider. But that was precisely the point. Diana was not choosing someone to work within the system. She was choosing someone she could trust to work against it if necessary. She was choosing someone whose loyalty was to her, not to the institution that had caused her so much pain. When she signed the documents, she reportedly wept. She is said to have told Burrell that the papers represented her last act of freedom. That description reveals everything about how she understood what she was doing. This was not administrative. This was liberation. The will was the final place where she got to be completely herself, where no one else could rewrite the language or redirect the intention or quietly bury the parts that made the establishment uncomfortable. The palace learned about the specifics of the will after Diana's death in August 1997, and the reaction was, by most accounts, deeply uncomfortable for those in royal circles. The idea that a butler, a member of the household staff, held the keys to the estate of the most famous woman in the world was not something the institution had anticipated or prepared for. Burrell now had the authority to manage her jewelry, her personal effects, her financial distributions, her charitable bequests. He could make decisions about what was sold, what was preserved, and what story those decisions told. He was, in the most literal sense, the guardian of Diana's voice. The years that followed Diana's death were not quiet, and Paul Burrell was at the center of some of the most turbulent chapters. In 2002, he was arrested and charged with stealing 321 items from Diana's estate, including personal correspondence, gowns, and other significant objects. The accusation was explosive. Here was the man she had trusted above all others, the man she had placed in charge of her legacy, facing criminal charges for theft. The trial attracted enormous media attention, not simply because of the legal stakes, but because of what it threatened to expose. Burrell, as executor and as the person who had been closest to Diana in her final years, knew things. He had documents. He had letters. He had context. The case collapsed in extraordinary circumstances. Queen Elizabeth II herself intervened, informing the prosecution that she recalled a prior conversation with Burrell in which he had explained his intention to hold certain items for safekeeping on Diana's behalf. With that, the charges were dropped. What exactly motivated the Queen's intervention remains a matter of debate among royal historians. Some see it as a straightforward clarification of fact. Others suggest that the palace had very specific reasons for wanting the trial to end before certain evidence could be introduced in open court. What happened next only deepened the mystery and the controversy. In 2003, Burrell published a memoir titled A Royal Duty, in which he revealed extensive details about Diana's private life, her fears, her relationships, and her innermost feelings about the royal family. The book caused an enormous uproar. Princes William and Harry both expressed profound hurt and anger over what they described as a betrayal of their mother's confidence. Charles reportedly responded with fury. The palace characterized the publication as deeply inappropriate. But there's another way to read what Burrell did, a way that is more sympathetic to the understanding that Diana herself might have had of him. He was not simply writing a book for profit. He was continuing the project she had given him, ensuring that the world knew who she really was. The same woman who had sat down with Martin Bashir to tell her story on national television was the woman who had appointed Burrell as the keeper of that story. There's a reasonable argument that what he published was exactly what she would have wanted published, which was the truth, unfiltered and unmediatable by palace press officers. In 2010, Burrell organized an auction of Diana's personal items, including clothing, accessories, and other objects from her time as Princess of Wales. The auction raised over £1 million, much of which was directed toward charitable causes she had supported. The palace's lawyers examined the transactions closely, looking for any indication of impropriety. They found nothing actionable, but the broader tension was unmistakable. The establishment had not reconciled itself to the fact that a man who had worked in service was now shaping the legacy of a woman who had once been at the center of the royal family. Every auction, every media appearance, every interview Burrell gave was another reminder that Diana had made a choice, and that choice was irreversible. The emotional consequences for William and Harry were complex and played out very differently in each of them. William, as the heir to the throne, was navigating the impossible territory between grief for his mother and obligation to the institution she had spent her later years resisting. He channeled much of his grief into public work, helping to establish the Diana Award in her memory, working on mental health advocacy, and building a public persona that drew on her warmth while remaining within the palace's expectations. His private feelings about Burrell's handling of the estate were reportedly far less composed. Harry's trajectory was different. His 2023 memoir, Spare, gave the world a remarkably candid account of what it felt like to grow up in the shadow of his mother's death, inside an institution that he describes as being fundamentally incapable of emotional honesty. His decision to step back from royal duties in 2020, to move abroad with his wife Meghan Markle, to speak publicly about the ways in which the palace had failed his family, all of it carries the unmistakable DNA of his mother's own rebellion. Diana chose confrontation over silence. Harry, in his own way, made the same choice. Whether or not that parallel was something Diana anticipated or even planned for is one of the most fascinating questions her story raises. Beyond the family drama and the legal controversies, Diana's will accomplish something that no royal document had ever accomplished before. It turned private wealth into public conscience on a global scale. The Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, which was established after her death and supported substantially through the mechanisms she had set in motion, contributed millions of pounds to AIDS research and patient support programs during a period when the disease was still widely misunderstood and the stigma surrounding it was actively killing people by preventing them from seeking treatment. The fund supported campaigns that changed public attitudes, funded research that contributed to treatment advances, and helped create infrastructure for care in communities that had been entirely overlooked. The £3 million directed toward anti-landmine work contributed to the international campaign to ban landmines, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. That is not a coincidence of timing. Diana's walk through the Angolan minefield and the global conversation it ignited was a direct catalyst for the diplomatic momentum that produced the Ottawa Treaty. By 2023, more than 160 countries had signed the treaty, and tens of millions of landmines had been destroyed. The link between one woman's courage in January 1997 and that scale of global change is direct and documented. Her childhood home, Althorpe, was transformed into a museum and memorial site that draws approximately 100,000 visitors each year. It keeps her story accessible not as royal mythology, but as human biography, as the story of a real woman who felt real pain and turned it into real action. The Althorpe estate, which Diana's family maintains with a portion of proceeds from the memorial program, ensures that future generations will encounter her not through palace-approved narratives, but through the artifacts of her actual life. The money from jewelry sales, most famously a stunning sapphire ring sold at auction, was directed toward Elton John's AIDS Foundation, continuing a personal friendship that had always been defined by a shared commitment to people who were suffering and overlooked. That friendship and the causes it supported outlived Diana in exactly the ways she would have wanted. But perhaps the most important element of her legacy cannot be measured in pounds or treaty signatures. It can be measured in the shift she produced in what people expected from public figures, particularly royal ones. Before Diana, the dominant model of royal public life was dignified distance. Royals appeared at official functions. They supported carefully selected charities. They maintained the composure that the institution required. Diana destroyed that model so completely that it never recovered. The emotional availability she demonstrated, the willingness to actually touch people, to sit with them in their suffering, to let them see that she was suffering too, changed what the public believed it was entitled to expect. Every royal who has worked in a humanitarian capacity since Diana has done so in a landscape she fundamentally altered. The bar she set was not one of glamour. It was one of authentic human engagement. She demonstrated that the most powerful thing a famous person can do is not to maintain the mystique of distance, but to surrender it entirely. Diana was 36 years old when she died. She had been married, divorced, publicly humiliated, privately sustained by causes larger than herself, and she had spent the final years of her life building something that she knew would outlast her. The will was the capstone of that project. The decision to appoint Paul Burrell was not an act of sentimentality. It was an act of strategy. Diana understood power. She had watched it operate against her for years, had felt its mechanisms of suppression firsthand, had learned to work around it with a skill that grew more sophisticated over time. When she chose Burrell, she was making a calculation. The person best positioned to protect her legacy was not the one with the most institutional authority, but the one with the most personal knowledge. Not the one who owed loyalty to the palace, but the one who owed loyalty to her. That calculation has proven correct in ways that even Diana might not have fully predicted. Burrell's management of her estate, controversial as it has been, has kept her story alive and complicated and human in ways that institutional management would never have permitted. The palace would have preferred a cleaner narrative, a settled legacy, a Diana shaped by the needs of the monarchy rather than by the truth of her own life. Burrell, for all his flaws and all the controversy he attracted, delivered something closer to her actual truth. The deeper lesson of Diana's will is not really about money at all. It is about the relationship between power and trust. It is about a woman who understood that the people who hold official authority are not always the people who can be trusted with what matters most. It is about the courage required to make unconventional choices in high-stakes situations. It is about what legacy actually means, not the sanitized version of a life that institutions prefer to remember, but the living, complicated, still evolving influence of a person who chose to be fully herself. Diana's estate did not simply transfer wealth. It transferred intention. It transferred a set of values, a way of seeing the world, a commitment